there was a point at which I was sitting there and thinking, I'm about to die. And it was a combination of symptoms from heart racing, vision blacked out, vision blurring, chest pains, sweating, like just this combination of symptoms that was insane. I had every one good in my life that I could ever ask for. And I sacrificed them for drugs and alcohol.
Welcome to Recover the Valley podcast by Sanctuary Recovery Centers. The voices are yours, the stories are yours. Through shared experience, shared hope and community, we focus on true healing from addiction. True stories, true community, truly you.
Welcome, everybody, to the latest episode of Recover the Valley podcast, brought to you by Sanctuary Recovery Centers. My name is Kyle Cummings, your host, and I'm so glad to be doing this once again. For those of you tuning in for the first time, welcome. For those tuning in again, welcome back. I'm really excited today. Today, we have an amazing guest, Shane Watson, and I don't want to divulge too much of your story. I'm going to let you do that on your own. But our mission here, obviously, is we're trying to create a platform to where we can reach as many people as possible, educate the people about what's going on with addiction, and hopefully encourage some people out there to get help. And if friends, family know of people suffering, ways that they can get them help. So truly a great honor to have you here. And I'd love for you to just we'll just get right into it. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your story, what got you here, and the struggles, but also the successes. And, I'm just grateful to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. My story doesn't begin like a lot of people assume a story about addiction and recovery is going to begin. A lot of people assume that in order to go down that path, you have to look back and see some kind of trauma or tragedy in your childhood. My story actually begins very positively. I grew up in an amazing home in North Phoenix with two amazing, loving parents, wonderful grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles, friends, and family, and had a really positive, healthy childhood, and I loved my life. Got great grades in school, went to church, I was a Boy Scout, you name it. Everything changed for me right around middle school. I was a scared, awkward kid, desperately wanted to be liked, desperately wanted to fit in, and not only did I not fit in, I really stood out, and not necessarily in ways that were positive. And I was going through some pretty vicious bullying at the hands of my classmates at that point in junior high. I was going through bullying from people who, up to that point, I had considered friends. And I became so desperate to get their approval and to fit in. I became willing to do anything it took to get what I thought at the time was friendship.
Right.
And I noticed that as I did crazier and riskier and more bizarre things, I got what I thought at the time was friendship. I got laughter. I got attention. Now, looking back, I realize that's not friendship. Right. But at the time, it didn't matter to me. Even if I had recognized that, I wouldn't have cared because it was filling a need that I had. Mm-hmm. So you take a kid that's young and inexperienced, I was in 7th grade, and someone that is so desperate for other people's approval, he's willing to do anything. Yep. And that right there is the recipe. That's the setup for drinking or using for the first time.
Now, so do you think that some of your morals were compromised in order to get that acceptance?
When I look back, I definitely compromised my morals. I compromised what I knew to be right. My parents raised me with a very good sense of right and wrong, what's appropriate at what ages and what's not appropriate. But you get into those junior high years, those high school years, and your peers' opinions start to take precedence over your parents' opinions or even your own morals or values. So that first night, I stole alcohol. I had a friend that was staying over for the weekend. We stole alcohol that belonged to my parents because my thinking was not only was that going to impress him, but he's going to go back to school the next week and he's going to tell the other guys what we did. Yeah. And my reputation is set at that point. Yeah. That's how I'm going to make it. So we stole the alcohol, we drank it, but here's the strange thing. Nothing happened. And I don't mean that it didn't affect us because it did, but I mean there was not an immediate consequence. My parents didn't find out, the teachers didn't find out at school the next week, the world didn't suddenly come to an end. So in my inexperience, when nothing I could notice, key phrase there, nothing I could notice went wrong right away, I said, this isn't so bad. They tell us in school how dangerous this is.
Almost exhilarating.
Oh, yeah, we just did it. We got away with it.
Yeah.
So I was waiting for this instant lightning bolt of consequence to come down and hit me. And I've realized something since then about consequence. There is a consequence. There is a price to pay for every negative or unhealthy decision we make in life, but they don't always happen right away.
Yep.
We don't always notice them right away, and sometimes they follow us down the road, and that'll make sense at the end of my story. What started with that drink in junior high, which didn't seem like a big deal at the time, none of these steps seemed like a big deal at the time. In retrospect, they were. It turned into something much bigger by the time I was in high school. When you're in high school, alcohol is a lot easier to get. Yep. Friends had fake IDs, their siblings would buy for us. Some of my friends' parents bought us alcohol. Right. So I went from drinking that one time in junior high to drinking every couple weekends, then every weekend, then a few days a week, and it was just starting to snowball.
Gradual progression.
Absolutely. And it was so deceptively gradual that it wasn't like I woke up one day and I'm suddenly doing heroin, which comes in later down in the story. There was nothing that jolting that occurred. It was subtle. It was really gradual. Right. But eventually alcohol as something that was more frequent in my life led to marijuana as a junior in high school. And then by the time I was in college, as a college freshman, the floodgates started to open. And the floodgates really opened when I had a friend that lived in the dorm with me, a college athlete that had an injury and had sports surgery and got prescribed opioid painkillers. He didn't like how they made him feel, and so I said, I'll buy those from you. And I ended up using the entire bottle, and it's important to remember that this was back in the 1990s. This isn't like now where physicians will write a 3 to 5 day prescription. This was back when you could get 30, 60, 90 days worth all at once.
Right. Less regulation.
Oh, absolutely. We didn't have the awareness that we have now about opioids and the dangers involved.
Oh, and they were really quick to write, more so even then, to just write them.
Absolutely.
Large amounts, heavy doses.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, not only were they more likely to write the prescription, this guy's prescription, when that first bottle ran out, I went back to him and said, see if you can get a refill.
Yeah.
He got a refill, sold that to me. See if you can get another refill.
Less regulation,
he ended up with 3 or 4 refills. And as you probably know from your experience in recovery and working with people in recovery, it does not take very long when it comes to opioids to be down that path of dependence.
Especially if you already have like a predisposition and you've already been regularly drinking or using drugs, you add that to the mix and it doesn't take long at all to latch on for most people.
And so it was already a lifestyle as it was with the alcohol and the marijuana, alcohol and smoking, that not only was there already a disposition toward it, it was basically something that I had moved from doing as a leisure thing to this is just what I do. This is how I find happiness. This is how I deal with unhappiness. So that door that was opened with the opioid painkillers took me down a path no one ever pictured me going down. The people that met me as a kid, the straight A student, the honest kid, the kid that was a rule follower, would have never believed that within a few years of college graduation, yes, I graduated, don't ask me how, but somehow I managed to make it through.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
By the grace of God. I had moved from using alcohol and marijuana and prescription pills to someone who was struggling with cocaine, crystal meth, and heroin at various points, and at some points in combination.
Yeah.
And my life was beginning to get so out of control. When you throw those ingredients in the mix, I mean, that is the recipe for chaos right there.
Yeah. It's not often you'll hear of people doing successfully while combining those substances. Like, it's just it's not possible.
Not for any amount of time, really.
Yeah.
And I held it together for varying lengths of time, and eventually when those take hold of your life, you can't keep it together. And there's a point you reach when you're so far down that path of addiction, you just stop caring about holding it together. Yeah. So I had relationships that had gotten damaged, friendships, family relationships, my marriage. I got married to someone shortly after college that I had met during college, during a 3 to 4 month period of sobriety. So she met me during the only 3 to 4 months in college that I did not drink or use, and fell in love with the person that I actually am, clean and sober.
Because that's who you really are. Right.
And met the real me, but didn't realize that I had struggled with drugs and alcohol. And I didn't tell her about it because I genuinely thought I was done at that point.
Right.
Well, sure enough, a few months into the relationship, I had started drinking and using again, lying about it, covering it up. And we're newlyweds. We're on that honeymoon phase where everything's supposed to be unicorns and rainbows, and even the other person's faults are adorable.
Yeah.
And we were already in chaos, not because of anything she did, but because of my behavior related to drugs and alcohol. Things that were causing trouble related to drugs and alcohol in our marriage were dishonesty, lying about where I was, who I was with, what I was doing, money being spent, thousands of dollars emptying out of a savings account. And that was not enough to get me to stop. You know, the relationships that I had damaged didn't get me to stop. Tens of thousands of dollars lost didn't get me to stop. Another thing that didn't get me to stop that would probably get most people to stop was overdoses. And so there were alcohol poisoning incidents that I dealt with, and there were overdoses, more than one. One in particular, I will never forget, and it is probably the closest I've ever come to dying. And I had been binging for about 3 to 4 days while my wife was out of town back to Illinois, where she grew up. And I had been combining large amounts of alcohol, methamphetamine, and cocaine. And then I managed to get a hold of fentanyl. Now, this is back in 2005. So people didn't really have the awareness like they do right now about fentanyl.
A lot different then than now.
Very different. And I knew what it was. So a lot of the people now that are overdosing on it and dying from it, they don't realize they're getting fentanyl. They often are buying illicit, fake prescription pills.
Yeah.
I knew what I was getting. I was getting fentanyl patches, and I was aware I was getting them. That combination of those substances for 3 to 4 days straight, not eating, not sleeping, not hydrating,
just does a toll on you.
It nearly took my life. And there was a point at which I was sitting there and thinking, I'm about to die. And it was a combination of symptoms from heart racing, vision blacked out, vision blurring, chest pains, sweating, like just this combination of symptoms that was insane. And I remember having a thought at that moment, I should call 911. I'm dying right now. And anyone who's thinking clearly, rationally, making healthy, positive decisions that was feeling any of those symptoms, and certainly that combination of symptoms, would pick up the phone and call 911.
That's the sensible act to do.
Exactly.
Sure. Yeah.
And the problem is, when you're under the influence, you're not thinking clearly, and perhaps most frighteningly, you think you are. So I told myself, okay, if anything else goes wrong, if any other symptoms happen, okay, I'll pick up the phone. I'll call 911. Okay. A few minutes later, the universe called my bluff because additional symptoms started happening. And sure enough, I backed out of it and said, nope, not going to call. Because, if the ambulance comes, there's drugs and paraphernalia laying all around the house. I can't get out of this chair to clean them up. They're going to find out. Then my family and my friends are going to find out. You know what? I'm not ready for them to know.
Legal ramifications.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I was willing to roll the dice on dying and never seeing my family ever again because I didn't want them to know, and there might be some legal issues. I was willing to risk dying, and I knew I was dying.
Yeah.
That's the insanity of addiction. So broken relationships, tens of thousands of dollars gone, overdose. The other thing that didn't get me to stop was my first arrest for a pretty serious charge. So I had gone from having a lifetime of a clean criminal record to being arrested for some serious charges. And I'm sitting in a holding cell in 4th Avenue Jail in downtown Phoenix. And I'm thinking to myself, I might have a problem. Yeah. I'm sitting in a holding cell for the first time ever, and that's all I can admit to. I might have a problem.
You're doing that little weigh the scales, like, well, but...
And that was the next thing. The scale tipped back the other way.
Yeah.
Because the next thought was, well, obviously I have a problem. I'm sitting here in jail. I'm not going to stop doing what I do, meaning drinking and using, because that's what helps me cope with my problems.
Yeah.
Never mind the fact
rationalization.
that every problem I had in my life at this point was caused by drinking and using.
Yeah.
It was that justification, those excuses, that we make for ourselves. So what it finally took to get me to stop, and then I'll talk about what's different since then. About 3 years to the day from that last arrest, the same calendar day, November 28th, 3 years later, I was still drinking and using, daily in fairly large quantities, no longer to feel any of the so-called good effects, which are a lie. You're stealing happiness and brain chemistry from your own future.
Right.
Drinking and using to not go through withdrawals, the physical, mental, emotional pain that you feel when you're addicted to something and you quit using
to
it.
avoid that extreme, often agony.
And that's exactly what it is.
Mostly physical, but emotional, mental,
spiritual,
everything, for sure.
And that kept me stuck in that. And I took a look at my life, and I took a look at the relationships I had damaged, the money I had lost, the time I had lost, the potential I felt I had completely wasted. I looked at the fact that several family members had died in the prior few years, and I wasn't there for them to support them. I didn't grieve correctly. I was too busy just numbing myself the entire time. I looked at all of the wreckage that I had created, and I thought to myself that night, November 28th, 2011, I have come too far. I have broken too many relationships. I've burned too many bridges. I have caused too much damage. I'm never coming back from this.
Right.
I'm going to die, probably sooner rather than later, and it is what it is. I'm going to ride this train till it crashes. I consciously quit on life.
Just conceded to let's ride this till it ends,
Yep.
and I'm okay
Gave
with
up.
that. Wow.
Later that night, under the influence, all of that chaos of nearly 20 years of substance use, the loss, the wasted time, the wasted potential, everything built up, and it hit all at once. And I completely lost control, and I hurt people. And I don't mean I proverbially hurt people, because I had proverbially hurt plenty of people up to the point.
Right.
I mean I lost control, and I physically hurt people who deserved nothing but happiness. Now, I was in blackout for much of the evening, but I remember certain moments, like almost like little individual snapshots, like still frames.
Yeah.
And I remember the moment when it hit me what I had done that night. And I remember thinking to myself, I've already thrown my entire life away, and now I'm the guy that's hurting people. And I said, I'm done. And I went down the hallway, and I locked myself into a spare bedroom in the house, and I attempted to end my own life. And I thank God, genuinely, that I did not. We wouldn't be having this conversation. The story would not have the chance to go where it's gone, which we'll talk about. Right. And so I want to emphasize to anyone that may be watching this, if you ever have thoughts or feelings of suicide, please tell someone. Yeah. Tell a caring, available, non-judgmental person immediately.
That is absolutely so important, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's not uncommon, because that's part of my story too. And I thank God too as well that I didn't go through with it or make those actions. And so thank you for touching on that.
Yeah, thank you. While I was in that room where I locked myself in attempting to end my own life, 911 was being called by someone else, as it should be. A few minutes later, I walked up my front door. I was greeted by 6 Phoenix police officers, a couple of them with their guns drawn at low ready. I was arrested. I was handcuffed. I was charged with 2 misdemeanors and 2 felonies. And if I'd been convicted of everything I was charged with, I was looking at the possibility of doing somewhere around 3 to 5 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. And when I woke up the next morning in Durango jail, a place that's loud and crowded and chaotic and violent. Yeah. You probably are. You know yes. Exactly what I'm talking about. And it's in this place of all places that the reality is hitting me. I had everyone good in my life that I could ever ask for. And I sacrificed them for drugs and alcohol. And I asked myself, how did I get here? And I don't just mean what happened last night, right. Although I was asking that. How did I become this? I had nothing but time to sit in that cell and trace it back. And what I traced it back to was that first drink in 7th grade. Yeah. As innocent, as harmless, as nothing as I told myself that was at the time, if I'm being honest, that's what opened that door.
Right.
That was the first step on that path. And I remember sitting there a couple days later in my cell, sweating, shaking, vomiting, going through withdrawals, which are horrible anywhere. They were particularly bad in one of Sheriff Joe's jails. Yes. Medical care does not exist. The guards laughed at me because they knew that I got myself into that position.
Right. Lack of empathy from them. For sure.
But it was in this place, in this moment, where I was feeling the worst physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional pain that I've ever felt, all wrapped up into one, that I made myself a promise. I made myself a promise to make my faith, my family, and my recovery my priorities.
Moving forward after that.
Yeah.
It's interesting that, because me too, it's the same story, that in one of the most dreary places, in dreary states of mind and body, that you make the biggest revelations. It's interesting to think that in a decrepit jail is when you have one of the biggest life-changing moments of your life. But because I can relate, the same thing happened to me in a prison cell in Florence. So it's just interesting that juxtapose of that, like the most incredible in the most worst place at the same time. So that's great.
And my family let me sit in that awful place. I called them and I was like, hey, can you bail me out? And they're like, no, we're going to let you sit there. And it broke my heart, but it was absolutely the right thing for them to do. And I've gone back and told them this since then. And it is funny. It's exactly what you say, this place that where nothing good, you don't see anything good there. It's a chaotic place, but good can happen to there.
Absolutely.
Can happen in even a place like that. Because when it comes to God, when it comes to my higher power, God is not limited to where he can do things.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Absolutely. If you have the willingness, you can be in a correctional institution and things can change. And so I gained the willingness. The fire was lit. I will do anything to not be this person.
So after you made that promise, that declaration with your higher power on your side, definitely in that moment, what happened?
Eventually, I was visited by a pastor who came to Durango to do church services. He was a family friend, and he was the one that told my parents not to bail me out. So he said, no, let him sit there. He came and visited me, and he said, he is a broken man.
Right.
He is contrite. Told my parents, you can bail him out now. I moved into the Phoenix Dream Center, which Pastor Walt, was a pastor there at the Phoenix Dream Center. It is a life recovery school, a place where people who are recovering from drugs and alcohol, former gang members, survivors of human trafficking, formerly homeless people, can learn to live with faith as the centerpiece of their life.
Excellent.
While I was there, I propelled myself into my faith. I was no longer drinking and using. I made God the centerpiece of my life. I started working on myself and looking at what do I need to improve. And I started bringing back in the things that used to be important to me when I was a kid to bring me happiness that I got rid of when alcohol and drugs became my focus. Music, writing, art, sports, fitness, nutrition, hiking. Because it's not as simple as, well, don't do drugs, don't drink. What do you do to get that natural dopamine release?
Yes.
And it was in that place that I began to gain back my self-respect. I began to gain back others' trust. I started to laugh again, and I started to have hope again.
Yes.
And where it went from there, I don't know if you want me to tell you where it went from there, or if you have another question for me.
I would like to hear, so I know you're so heavily involved in organizations and outreach, and I wanted to definitely give you some time to touch on what you do for the community today and some of the organizations you're affiliated with, because I know all the work and passion you guys have to help others. So please tell us about those.
As a result of that last arrest, I ended up a convicted felon. I ended up with a permanent felony. So my bachelor's degree in communications became virtually worthless.
Okay.
I was getting turned down for unskilled warehouse labor, and everything I applied for, I was being told, we don't hire felons. So the way I got into the mental and the behavioral health field, where I've spent the last decade, was again another God moment.
Right.
As a part of that last arrest, I was assigned to 46 weeks of one type of counseling and 15 weeks of another. In one of those counseling groups, someone heard me talking about my frustration with not being able to get hired because of my felony. And I'm saying, boy, the willingness I have now, I will come with 100% for anybody that gives me a chance. So this gentleman overheard me, and he's like, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be eavesdropping. Do you have a story to tell? I said, oh man, do I have a story to tell? He said, do you have any public speaking experience? I said, I have tons. He said, are you at least a year sober? I was 9 months at the time. I said, no, I'm 9 months. He said, when you are a year sober, go and apply at a place called notMyKid. It is a youth-focused mental and behavioral health organization.
Yes.
So I went in there when I was a year sober. I applied, I was hired, and I was sent out to share my addiction and recovery story with youth in schools. Wonderful. And for the first time in my life, when I stood up there and I shared what up to that point had seemed like pure chaos and wasted time, God turned that into grace and into a platform. And I stood there and I thought to myself, this is the first time in my life that I feel purpose. This is it right here. And we talked off camera earlier about having purpose and giving back. Absolutely. And how crucial that is to someone in recovery.
And what I always like to mention to people when I help share my experience, strength, and hope, or help encourage them, is that those things of your past now that used to carry shame, guilt, remorse, and used to burden me heavily, is now, like you just meant, is your greatest asset.
Yes.
You're fortunate that you went through that because it aids in helping other people. Because I can come and try and say, like this, that, I want to help you. But if I don't have some weight and merit to show that, hey, this is what I went through and look at where I'm at today, then it creates that solid like example. And they're like, well, okay, there's some weight to this guy and his story. If he can do it, then there's hope for me too.
And that's exactly it, hope. That's the word right there. When they see that I'm not just throwing out flowery, encouraging words, you can do it, which I believe in encouraging people in general. Yeah. I can put substance behind it and say, let me tell you why hope is real. Let me tell you why you can not only escape the pain of what you're caught up in right now, but you can thrive. I lived it firsthand.
Right.
And if I can do it, I genuinely believe that anyone can do it. So that started with notMyKid as me being a very part-time speaker educating youth. Within 3 months was made full-time. Within 4 months was given a staff position. And at the end of the 9 years that I spent there, I did over 600 speaking engagements throughout the United States.
Incredible.
Over 100 TV interviews, got to be on the Today Show, got to go out and learn how to do suicide intervention. And because of, like you said, those personal experiences, there are people that felt comfortable revealing to me, I'm thinking about ending my own life. Yeah. And when I'm able to say to them, I know what that feels like, and they see there's not only no judgment, but there's true empathy, that is where the walls come down and healing begins. And you talk about finding a sense of purpose and feeling like I did something that actually matters, and we all want that as human beings.
Feeling, I know it. Yep.
Is when you have someone that tells you, I am alive today because of what you did.
It's unparalleled to any other feeling.
There is no dollar amount, there's no career, there's no amount of fame or power that can beat that. And you know what? I go to bed every night now, happy with what I'm having the opportunity to do, and at peace as well. And that is just a matter of willingness. God, use me how you can use me. Right. And from one day to the next, that may look a little bit different. And the way that God has used me in this last year is right around my 9-year anniversary with notMyKid, I saw a physical change in my dad. And I knew that my time with him was very limited. So I ended up resigning from notMyKid and made my dad the focal point, spending the time I had left with my mom and dad. Shortly after I did that, he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I made the most of every minute that I had with him. I became his secondary caregiver. I drove him to and from his doctor's appointments, to and from the store. And people were asking me, well, what about your career? You know what? That'll be there.
Right.
Sometimes the opportunity that God gives you is not necessarily something you're going to put on your resume.
Right.
But it's still, at the end of the day, you do it and you go, this mattered. So I lost my dad last month to cancer. But you know what? And we talked about this off camera. Yeah. The silver lining, I don't have any regrets with how I spent that time. When I didn't get sober, before I was sober, I talked about the regret of those family members that died, and I didn't make the most of that time. Right. What we have the power to do is not waste time, to make the most of the time and the opportunities we are given, and I did that with him. And the day that he passed, I had peace, knowing that we made the most of our time together, knowing that he has a relationship with his higher power. I'll see him again someday. And knowing that he saw me not only get sober, but thrive and create an incredible life for myself. That's the best that we can do.
Right.
And I'm so grateful for that.
And that's one thing to highlight, that even in sobriety and recovery, like, emotional, challenging things arise. And what we were discussing prior to the shoot was how I had lost my mother in recovery, and it's challenging, but the perspective point, like you just shared, is you can look at it so many ways, like, oh, I wish this could have happened, or I could have done this. But rather than think of that, you committed your time to connecting that bond as much as you could at the end, and being just grateful for that. And that's a perspective shift that I know changed in me as a result of God and recovery. And we're getting close on time here, and I know there's so many more organizations you're involved with, and we'll have links to those and stuff in the podcast connected to this link. But I also would like to ask you if there are people still out there, or there are people still out there right now suffering from substance use disorder, or family members of those who may think that their sons or cousins or aunts are suffering alcoholism addiction. What's something, or what would you encourage them to do to take the next step to make a change?
I would remind them that change absolutely is possible. I'm a living example of it.
Right.
If you had told me on that morning that I woke up in Durango that my life would look like it does today, I would not have believed you. I would have wanted to, but I wouldn't have. Never mind 11 years out, which is where we are now. The way my life looked 1 year after I got sober,
night and day,
was 180 degrees from where I was. So hope is real. I didn't get sober till around 35 years old. And a lot of times I meet people who feel like I'm so late in the game. It's too late now. I can't get sober now. I've lost too much time. Or people who are thinking their spouse or their child or their parent, it's too late in the game. If you're breathing and your heart is beating, it's not too late in the game. I have lost count of how many people that I have met who have stories similar to mine and stories far beyond mine even, who today are not only sober, not only are they not drinking and using, they are genuinely thriving. They wake up every morning thanking God with gratitude. Today is another day, another opportunity. They go to bed every night at peace.
Yeah.
And I want to encourage you, step number 1 is don't be in denial. Acknowledge what you see. Acknowledge the reality of it. Number 2, know that even if you are struggling, you still have value and worth as a person.
Absolutely.
Your struggles do not define you. How you respond to them can determine your legacy and where you go down the road. Get connected with help. Go to meetings. Get a sponsor. Work your steps. I'm also a huge fan of professional help, counseling, therapy, intensive outpatients, support groups, you name it. There are so many opportunities out there. It takes guts to ask for help.
Yeah.
But when you do, it does not take very long to realize you are not alone, and there are countless people who are in the same place or were in the same place that you were. And it won't be very long if you take those steps where you're going to be in the place where they are, with that gratitude, that peace, and that hope.
And that's the mission here. We're out here to help, and it doesn't matter whether your upbringing was affluent and great or you had a traumatic childhood. Like, this disease does not discriminate, but the solution can be the same. And I said that the destination is the same. We all want to reach a point of happiness and purpose and gratitude and not to be afflicted by this disease anymore. The destination is the same, just the details are a little bit different. And thank you, Shane Watson, so much for coming and sharing your story. And, again, I encourage you guys to reach out. Click the links associated with this podcast if you have any questions or concerns or want help, because I truly believe that together we can recover the valley. Thank you for tuning in.